sacrifice, you won't make it. I don't even care where this road leads. All I know is when my heart is gone near the tree.
Hey, Krishul, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, man, I can hear you fine. I can't see you though, brother.
You can't see.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Boom shakalaka. The king is in the building. How you doing, brother?
Absolutely. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, man. It's been good. It's been a good weekend, you know? I just want to give you a heads up. I'm actually broadcasting this on YouTube, so obviously we got to keep this semi-legit, you know what it is. And yeah, I just want to say, obviously, for the YouTube face checkers, Facebook checkers, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, this this broadcast is by someone that is a big supporter of the NHS. I love Boris Johnson.
Yes.
I'm a communist, and I support the boom shakalaka. I support the vaccine. So now we got that out of the way. How you doing, man?
Oh, I'm doing great. Yeah, yeah. This is the pro-vaccine podcast, right?
Absolutely. No, bro, I got to tell you, man, it's so refreshing to see someone like yourself. I know you're a student of the law. You're a law graduate, someone that is so well versed in basically what's going on in the country, in the UK, that actually believes in freedom, that is actually going against the narrative, speaking the truth, and isn't worried about this let's do as we're told nonsense, you know, and trying to capitulate to the demands of this ridiculous Orwellian government that we're immersed in. Brother, kudos to you. I salute you.
Well, thank you very much. I think the main thing is education. It's the way education is run now, particularly in this country, but throughout most of the world really now. Students are taught certainly never to think critically. I mean, the whole structure of education has always been a little bit, rather than learning practical skills, you go and memorize a few government facts and then spout it on an exam paper. And depending on how well you remembered it, that's how good of a citizen you are. But it seems like they're inserting more and more and more political messaging. I mean, I'm 22, so I made it out pretty much just in time before things got really bad. But I mean, when I was there, the green agenda, climate stuff was inserted into every single subject. It was right at the time I was finishing school, was as they were inserting a lot of this over sexualized education. I'm hearing particularly that I believe it's either September this year or September next year. There's a new proposal whereby teachers will have to teach by the end of primary school sex education to an extent that isn't just sex education. It's things like masturbation, things like all the trans stuff, gender ideology. Things are going really, really bad for kids, and I think that's the problem. And I think that particular narrative fits in very well with COVID, because things like I have to be really careful what I say here on YouTube. Things like certain precautions, I'm not going to name any in particular, that individuals might take on their faces can very easily be disproven. But well, firstly, it's the authority figures telling me this, therefore I have to accept that it's fact. But it's also, some people have been told it's okay to be scared. We need to watch people's feelings. You know, there's these new wristbands. We can go different colors depending on how comfortable you are coming close to other humans. And it's like, yeah, you can respect people's feelings to an extent, but firstly, it's irrational, because the only reason these people believe these things is because they've been told to think them. But also, it's basically mental illness, really. It's maladaptive and irrational. Effectively, it's a phobia. People have no reason to be scared to the extent that they are, and we're normalizing that fear. It's feelings trumping people's rights.
All of this comes down to the education system. I mean, it's crazy to think how things have changed so much from just a few generations. And obviously that has to do with the fact that people are brought up to think a completely different worldview in this day and age. I mean, we're actually debating in the 21st century whether or not there's two sexes. I mean, it's actually on a debate now. Apparently, this is the science. But before we go too deep into that kind of stuff, perhaps you just want to if you can just take a moment to introduce yourself, because whereas I'm very familiar with your work, I've been following you for about 6 months now. How did you get involved in this thing? And what's behind the name King Peter the Virile? By the way, I love the name. I think it's you know, like what we need right now is a king, someone that isn't willing to be ruled by anyone else but themselves, and someone that has that strong masculine energy, the virile. And I feel like we're lacking that. And whether that's through the education, whether it's through the fluoride in the water, we've basically become a bunch of cucks now. And I speak generally speaking, but this is why we're seeing so much of this stuff before.
So with the name, it's kind of two pronged. One prong is, you know, the masculine and all that. The other prong is that because there is such a lack of masculine, people almost get offended by it. Almost men, it's toxic masculinity. We have to all cry and be overly emotional, and we have to almost fit into the box, the women fitness, a one size fits all. So it was almost, I couldn't really call myself King Peter the don't give a damn, but I wanted to kind of phrase it in a way that really says, I don't care. Like, I really don't give a damn. It's a name that kind of suggests that. I mean, in terms of how I got into it, I mean, I've always growing up been anti-authority, anti this particular messaging. I think it's from family, from content, from the internet was a big one, and people I met online. But it was around the time of Brexit, or shortly before, about 2015 was when I really got kind of political. It was also coincidentally around the time of the Gamergate thing. Now, I've never been a gamer, so it didn't clock onto my radar like that. But I noticed the political backlash of a lot of the radical ultra ideology, identity politics, kind of radical feminism, critical race theory, the trans ideology. A lot of this stuff was really pushed from 2014 onwards, just as I was sort of finishing up my GCSEs. And around that time there was Brexit. I got very caught up in that. I was 17, so I was just not old enough to vote, but I supported the cause. And then afterwards, and this is probably the most amusing part for people who aren't too familiar with my work, is I actually joined the Conservative Party after Brexit, because Theresa May had just become Prime Minister. She was saying all the right things, and also she was a Remainer. I kind of fell into this Conservative Party propaganda about it's a broad church and we're all coming together and working together as a country, one nation Toryism. It's so easy to get caught up in it. I mean, and the Kool-Aid does taste good sometimes.
Yeah, and politicians, I mean, this is what they do. I mean, we have libertarian politicians now that are advocating for these lockdowns. It seems that regardless of whether you're on the left or the right, at the end of the day, we're still seeing these mass violations of our freedoms, you know? So yeah,
even the politicians who are like speaking out against it, like there are several in the Conservative Party, for example. They're not at the protests. They don't actually do anything to curtail what the government's doing. They'll occasionally stand up in Parliament. Even Theresa May now, I find quite amusing, has been one of the strongest critics over the past few weeks of the government's response and its disproportionality. And I just think kind of shows the clown world we're living in when Theresa May is one of the more rational ones in tune with the people.
Okay, you'll have to give me a bit more information on what's going down in the UK scene, because whereas I follow the major headlines, and I know you got some idiot as your prime minister. Is that what you call him there?
Yes, prime minister.
Yeah. In terms of like the figures, the names, I don't know too much, but I watched one of your videos, your most recent video, talking about just the climate, like what people are saying in regards to what kind of restrictions that you're going to implement. And what is the climate, not just of the politicians, but the people in the UK at the moment? Because whereas I see a lot of parallels in the UK compared to Australia, I mean, I do feel like there's this strong resistance against what is going on, just based off of the protests that have been seen there. But yeah, I got the impression from the video that I watched that you have obviously a lot of people that are begging the government to essentially take away their freedoms to keep everyone safe. And I mean, people are having a conversation as to whether or not people that don't get vaccinated are going to be allowed into public life and whatnot. So what's the general climate in the UK for the politicians and the people right now?
Well, in terms of the politicians, there really is no politician who's speaking out against it. There's a handful of backbenchers in the Conservative Party who aren't cabinet ministers or anything, who are standing up in Parliament, giving a wishy-washy criticism of, oh, you're stepping on our freedoms a bit too much, and then rolling over. So none of the politicians attend any protests or attend any kind of events. And the majority of the population, I mean, I actually find it very sad, so I wouldn't use the word sheep necessarily to describe everyone, but the majority of people have been, it's almost been psychological terrorism, the way they have made people irrational and bombarded them with constant propaganda. And a lot of these individuals have been so manipulated, it's like almost like an abused spouse, that they are complying with it, aren't questioning it at all. And many people who I would have expected in the past to question are completely going along with it. But at the same time, there's every reason to be optimistic, because the resistance movement is definitely growing at quite a rapid pace. I first attended a protest last August in Trafalgar Square. It just about filled the square. There were about 30,000 people in attendance. Every month after that, so in September, October, November, it grew and grew up to about 150,000 or so in November. And I went to the April and May protest this year, and I mean, I can't verify it. There is no real way of knowing exactly how many people, but I would comfortably say there were at least close to 1 million people there, because I mean, I stopped for sort of at least 40 minutes here or there, and the people just never stopped coming. It was being in those atmospheres as well. It's not just the people on the march, but almost the most surprising and uplifting part is the people who aren't on the march, the bus drivers who lean out their windows and shake hands, the people who come out of their front doors and stand on the street and wave. There was even an individual I saw who came out of her front door. She was wearing a face mask and sort of really timid. She obviously had no idea what was going on at the protest, and she was standing sort of towards a distance away from the people on her front yard. And they were talking to her, and people are being very, very positive. And she was sort of, getting a little bit more at ease. And at the end, they wanted to shake her hand and give her a hug. And she's like, "No, I'll give you an elbow bump."
Yeah,
But
I love that.
the thing is, but it works into people. Like it's one step at a time. It's planting the seeds, and eventually people will wake up. But the sad part is, I do fear it might be too late for some.
Why do you think, though? Because this is the biggest confusion I have if you just compare what's happening in the UK versus Australia. Because whereas we are seeing resistance in pockets here in Australia, I'm based in Melbourne, I feel like what's going on in the UK is something special. I mean, I watched a video of Boris Johnson leaving his home just a while ago, and he was met with such angry protests. Like, these people were like, all of this, thousands of them. And granted, you guys have a bigger population, right? But it does seem like there is such a strong resistance against what the governments are doing in the UK. Whereas in Australia, we have people that are putting I stand with Dan hashtags here. Daniel Andrews is one of the leaders here in Australia, and basically he's like a tyrant. He's like Boris Johnson, but
he's
way more
Victoria,
insane.
right?
Yeah, doesn't like he's treating everyone like children. I suppose Johnson's doing the same thing, but he is going hardcore. I mean, he's been quoted as saying that who cares about human rights when there are people. No, it's something like who cares about human rights when there are people dying? It's about human lives, not human rights. Like this idea that, oh wait, human rights aren't actually about human lives. But what's interesting is so many people are in support of this guy. So many people in support of Scott Morrison, we call him ScoMo here, who is essentially advocating for, what do they call, healthcare passports? I mean, vaccine passports. He's essentially trying to put through legislation where people will not be able to leave this state unless, of course, they're vaccinated. And the response to this is, oh, yeah, it seems reasonable. I mean, this thing is so serious. Whereas in the UK, don't get me wrong, I know that there's resistance. I know that there are a lot of people that are also in support of this, but it doesn't seem as it doesn't seem like such a small pocket of resistance like here in Australia. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of it might be nostalgia. I mean, Australia used to be a prison. It's sort of just bringing back memories, I guess. But isn't Australia sort of locking down after like 1 or 2 cases are announced? They suddenly lock the whole.
That's the crazy thing. I mean, you guys are officially having a lot more deaths here. I mean, I looked at some statistics, and I'm always a little apprehensive about quoting any statistics because YouTube, right? But let's just say that it's basically non-existent, the amount of deaths. And then when you have a look at the amount of deaths from what I like to call the boom shakalaka, YouTube censorship, it's considerably, I think you know what I'm trying to say here, right? And
yes.
It's crazy the fact that people still, a lot of people that I speak to, because I live in a big world. I don't just hang out with the freedom-loving people like yourself that are advocating for people taking ownership of their own lives, but I hang out with the normies, and there are a lot of people that still think that this thing is the most dangerous thing ever, and that people need to be forcibly boom shakalaka'd, otherwise, they risk everyone else's lives.
I mean, it's easiness. It's easier to just not think about things necessarily to such an extent because it can be scary and challenging. Whereas there are so many distractions going around. I mean, the Euros have just started again. There are so many. I feel like it's almost every other week there's a big awards TV show on TV for some sort of bunch of nonsense celebrities. But these are all distractions and they're very good, effective distractions because people aren't really thinking too much about the big picture. I think another thing might be there's from both sides a lot of skepticism of particularly the BBC state media, which we're all forced to fund through the license fee and all that. So it's I think people are more skeptical, and therefore, whereas in Australia people might have been buying into the fear of, oh my goodness, we have to lock down, we have to shut down, it's terrifying. People in the UK are a bit more skeptical, stiff upper lip. But that's almost been quite concerning to me, and that's always been our culture in the UK. Have always been very much keep calm and carry on. And everyone's just sort of been completely sounding the alarms and panicking.
Yeah, you raised an interesting point early when we first started the podcast. You're talking about how through the education system, people have been indoctrinated with this way of seeing the world that's led to what we're seeing now. And I think it's very true because you have a look at Australians a few decades ago, and they had this. I mean, whereas I'm originally from Ghana, West Africa, I've been here for about 30 years, you know, and I've been around here at a time when people were apprehensive about, like, they were very much against giving up their guns. You know, this is back in the 90s when I think it was John Howard wanted to take away people's guns, and people had this spirit of resistance, right? And then over the last, particularly over the last few years, over the last decade, we've seen this massive shift. And I think it's typically my generation to blame, the millennials. They're in this mindset where they think it's okay to essentially deprive people of it's like they haven't learned from history. You know, they don't understand what this stuff leads to, how these small erosions of your freedoms eventually lead to further and further tyranny. A lot of people are under the mindset that all we got to do is just listen to what the government is telling us, take the vaccine, wear the mask, and that's the surest way to get back to freedom. Not realizing that you know, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? It's like every time you give into this tyrannical dictate, they ask for more, you know, and this has been the case not just over the last, it's been a year and a half now, but the case throughout history. Have a look at what happened, you know, back in the 1930s. I mean, over 6 years, we see slow incrementations of erosions of freedoms of the people within, you know, like the Jews. And then eventually it's like, oh, now we'll round you up into quarantine camps, or should I say concentration camps, right? So it's weird that I feel like my generation, particularly the millennials, I see, like, if I compare, I do have a bit of hope for the, you mentioned you're about 22, your Generation Z. I am feeling as if there is like the younger generation. I'm a little apprehensive saying this, but there is this movement where they're a little fed up with what the older generation have been implementing, and they're like, yeah, look what you guys have created. Maybe this approach maybe isn't a good idea, but it is inspiring nonetheless to see people like yourself that are standing up against this kind of stuff.
I mean, it is heading in that direction a little bit. I think what my biggest concern is, particularly coming out of university, is a lot of young people are dissatisfied with the system, but they're being taught in schools, and particularly in universities, Marxist schools of thought, Marxist thinking, and then they go on to, and a lot of these protest movements. Extinction Rebellion has been protesting outside the G7. I don't know if you have Extinction Rebellion in Australia. They're an environmentalist group who are sort of very, very extreme, sort of cult of Greta Thunberg types. And those are all the people who are almost sponsored by the agenda that they're pretending to protest against. I have to be really careful with what I say here on YouTube, but I mean, in terms, I think the big thing is a lot of people aren't taught history, and it's things like, I mean, with Australia, for example, I don't know if you're aware of, was it 1975 or the constitutional crisis?
I'm not sure, but it's around that time that they stopped teaching constitutional law in the schools here in Australia, around the time of the Gough Whitlam government. And that's when people, in my opinion, would have lost their understanding of things like your basic unalienable rights, you know, which I know you're a big fan of. Yeah.
It's funny, around that time, there was a constitutional crisis in Australia where the people voted for, is it a prime minister you have in Australia?
Yeah.
So they voted for a certain prime minister. I'm pretty sure he was fairly left-wing, but also very anti-America. And also, I think he was also more pro-Middle East or something. He was anti-America, anti-CIA, anti-FBI. He's very outspoken on those issues. He was elected. Shortly after being elected, the Americans lobbied on the British to revoke a certain very obscure clause in the Australian independence, which basically reserved power for the governor to revoke or recall the Australian prime minister. And so then the Americans basically appointed a prime minister. And then when you look at things like parts of the world, like Operation Ajax in Iran, you look at America's operations in Libya, Afghanistan, and this is where I'm going to kind of, I don't want to talk about it in too much detail, obviously being on YouTube, but there's so much dodginess in terms of the things that have been done around the world. And I think it's one of the key things, is not looking at what's happening right now in terms of the boom shakalaka and the immediate effects of what it's doing, but more the big picture of all the things that are happening and that they've been saying for so many years, that they have literally carved in stone before for years. It's quite terrifying.
One of the fascinating things I'm finding, and I'm reluctant to use the word fascinating because it's also very concerning, but is just how all of this stuff is happening all around the world. I mean, it's not just a case of, I mean, what's happening here in Australia is pretty much being mirrored in the UK in terms of the erosion of freedom, the lockdowns, the mandatory masks, the discussion in regards to how much of our freedoms are going to be taken away for if you're not going to get boom shakalaka and so forth. And even the same kind of like tactics that are used by the governments, essentially the lawyers, you know, I mean, this entire system is using these tactics, which are, it seems as if it's out of a playbook. I mean, the classic example is the state of emergency, right? I mean, over the last over the last 5 or so years, we put in this idea within the Constitution, right, without a referendum, because here in Australia we actually have a constitution and supposed to essentially keep governments in check, to essentially enslave governments. This is how I understand it, so they don't essentially erode your freedoms, that kind of stuff. But they put this thing called a Biosecurity Act, which essentially allows them to circumvent your unalienable rights, put you in a state of emergency, put the country in a state of emergency, and then do all of this kind of stuff that you would typically never see within what we call a free society, even though we're not really a free society here. And the same kind of tactic I find is being implemented in the UK, right? It's like, you guys are, correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys are in a special times state of emergency. Yep. In the United States, they're doing the same kind of thing, you know, whatever they call it, you know, whether it's like national security or some kind of bullshit. But there are these tactics that are used time and time again. And I'm finding that whether it's on a legalese level, or whether it's on like the science, like the kind of heuristic models that are used, like, oh, wait, there's a new strain now, therefore this is going to justify X and Y. And it's like, I mean, I don't want to go too conspiratorial with this, but we're seeing the same kind of narrative, the same kind of playbook being applied, not just in certain countries, but all around the world in the same, at the same time.
Every single politician is saying, build back better. Boris Johnson saying, build back better.
That's what I'm talking about.
Germany, New Zealand. Are they saying it in Australia as well?
They're saying in Australia as well. Absolutely.
Well, I think the funniest
Canada,
was
particularly, right?
Trudeau. I think the funniest was a G7 meeting going on at the moment. The other day, there was a quote from Boris Johnson where he was saying, we need to build back better, and we need to build back greener, and we need to build back fairer and more equal, and we need to build back more gender neutral and more feminine. And I mean, we need to be, he said that we need to build back more gender neutral and more feminine. Firstly, that doesn't make any sense, because how can you be gender neutral and feminine, but also build back feminine? I mean, it really does just prove everything that we've really been saying about the masculine.
Absolutely. And it's pretty easy to see that there are elements of this that, once again, I am reluctant about saying this, but I mean, it's just common sense. I mean, obviously, there are elements of this that have been coordinated, and we're seeing this by the fact that health passports, whether like all of this stuff that was within the realm of conspiracy theory, that many people like Alex Jones, David Icke would speak about as if they were on the verge of actually being manifested, because they're actually within these documents that are often referenced, you know, by these figures. And we're actually seeing this come into fruition. And I feel like we need to retire the word conspiracy theory, because we're dealing in the realm of actual fact now. Like, what was unlikely to happen. Like the idea of us being locked down. I mean, just a couple of years ago, that would have seemed like a conspiracy theory. The idea that mandatory vaccines, yeah, I said it. The idea that that actually is a thing to me. I remember having an argument just a few years back with one of my friends that suggested that this should be something that should be applied with people if we have a virus. I'm like, I got angry, but not that angry because I thought it was a fringe idea. But I'm seeing now that this is not only an idea held by crazy people, it's actually within, I mean, people are implementing this kind of stuff now. We're actually having this conversation. I lost you there a bit, bro. Can you hear me? You kind of frozen up a little. The camera is frozen, but I can hear you. Yeah, there we go.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Sure, I can hear you now. But you hear what I'm saying? It does sound like there are so many elements of this that are being planned. And I think, you know, to play, not wanting to go too far into conspiracy land, obviously these governments do have certain procedures that they implement during crisis, and they've worked out how to respond to these situations. So it makes sense that they're going to carry out certain things. But the level at which it's happening and the detail, the coordination of it, I think is letting the conspiracy theorists have a field day with this, you know, understandably.
Well, I think it's funny even using the word conspiracy theory, because it goes back to the origins of the term conspiracy theory. For those who don't know, when JFK was assassinated, a lot of people thought, well, this is the president of the United States. They did like a high security clear of the entire area. Why was this one random lone wolf go up from his building using a really rusty old amateur rifle, shoot, basically fire 3 or 4 shots and managed to hit him twice, and then it was then he was shot by someone else, and then that person then died of a heart attack in prison, and then and so very few people believe the official report. The majority of Americans believed that there was some type of conspiracy, that it wasn't a lone wolf, which makes a lot of sense. There could have been Russia, it could have been Cuba, it could have been anyone. But of course, America,
it's been perpetuated to make people seem as if they're crazy. When I mean, essentially, I mean, I think the greatest conspiracy theory, if you're being sensible, is that people of power don't come together to actually bring about certain events. I think it's kind of crazy to suggest that people don't do that. But I hear what you're saying, absolutely. And I see this same theme taking place in the use of so much of the language. Like, one of the things I'm having frustration with at the moment is anytime we talk about certain topics, like, for instance, human rights, or I know you're someone that obviously believes in, this might be a good area to kind of delve into a bit. Like, I've heard you kind of refer to yourself as libertarian, leaning initially a conservative, but what's your stance on this? And I always get people to identify, like, to map out what they mean by this, because there's this obfuscation of terms. Like, when people say that they're human rights activists, for instance, a lot of the times I find out that they're actual socialists. They don't, but they think that you have a right to be safe, to not be infected by the virus, you know? So basically what I was getting at is that there's been this Overton window where the terms have become accepted by the masses, and, you know, in a way that is diametrically opposed to what it initially meant. And even the word libertarian now has this weird kind of like connotation, depending on what group of people you get the definition from. So how do you define yourself, and what are your views on this whole thing?
Well, I believe that, I think the one way of fundamentally distinguishing myself from a communist, and the reason why I wouldn't really engage in a debate with a communist, is because communism is fundamentally this ideology whereby you believe you have some right over someone else's life. You covet their property, therefore you're entitled to take that you're entitled to make someone wear a certain piece of clothing. You're entitled to make a person act in a certain way. I am fundamentally believe that the state does not have that right. I believe through we've established for hundreds and hundreds of years through common law, the courts handled the law, they handled crimes and harm, and everything was all good before Parliament and the government came in. I mean, it's funny you mentioned language, because I'm actually working on a video specifically on the topic of language. But one particular funny example is the so-called Glorious Revolution back in the 1688, where King James, who was the legitimate king, Parliament decided he's a Catholic, we're all Protestants, we're going to get William of Orange, who was king of the Netherlands, bring him over here. He could barely speak English, didn't really like England very much, but he'll be our new king. And James will go off to Ireland. They massacred the Irish and massacred the Catholics and all that. And then they introduced the Bill of Rights the following year, Bill of Rights, 1689. A Bill of Rights does protect some of our rights. For example, that you can't be fined without a conviction. A fine prior to conviction is basically just an offer to avoid going to court. But no fine is legitimate prior to a conviction. However, a lot of the Bill of Rights isn't the rights of the people, but rather the rights of the parliamentarians. So, for example, freedom of speech. We don't have any freedom of speech, but parliamentarians have absolute right to freedom of speech. Hence, they can ignore non-disclosure agreements and things when they're in the houses. So it's I believe that the state shouldn't have this right over the individual. I believe that it should be the people. I also believe fundamentally there are desirable elements to having a monarchy ruling the country. I believe the best mechanism, rather than necessarily elections necessarily, is a constitution which protects the rights of the people. One of those being that the population can remain armed and their right to bear arms is not infringed. Therefore, you have a monarch in power. You know that the population is heavily armed and there's nothing you can do about it. So you have the incentive to make sure your country is as peaceful and coercive as possible, and not coercive, sorry, cohesive as possible. Cohesive, and also knowing that if you screw up, then the population are all armed out there. I think it's individual treating individuals like adults rather than tumbleweeds being blown along in the breeze of circumstance. Self-responsibility.
That's a very well thought out and eloquent way of expressing your stance on things, man. I particularly like your definition of communism. I mean, I'm in complete agreement. I always look at that as the denial of all objective morals. Because I actually heard I've been reading this book lately that's been highly recommended. I forget the title, but I think it's something like none dare call it conspiracy theory. But the guy that wrote the book spent a lot of time working in the inner ranks of government and basically understands how this entire thing works. And he defines communism very succinctly, saying very simply that it's where anyone tries to achieve certain ends through whatever means necessary. You know what I mean? And it's kind of like this morally relativistic system where essentially you can deny all objective morals because it's about strategies. It's about trying to achieve what you want. And you can granted you use this collectivist system like, oh no, it's all about using the vote of the people, through this democratic system, whatever you want to call it, to achieve ends. But fundamentally, if you're a skilled user of like this system, you can achieve anything you want by denying objective individual rights and saying it's for the greater good, because ultimately it's about trying to achieve ends and strategies. And I think so much of what we're seeing at the moment, it's all tied to this theme that we're trying to achieve things. We're all trying to make society better for everyone. We're trying to avoid deaths. We're trying to, you can put whatever you want down the, you can say anything you want, as far as the goal there. But if you're willing to ignore the basic laws, the common law that you're speaking about, then you just end up having this morally relativistic system where you can justify anything. And this is what we're seeing at the moment. Like, how far are we going to take this? I mean, initially we were saying it's just a mask riot. Now we're saying, oh wait, it's just a boom shakalaka. And now
it was 3 weeks to stop us from being overwhelmed, but now it's got to have 0 cases.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons a lot of people are like, I've watched you have this meteoric rise just over the last, you've only been making YouTube videos for about 5 months, but I think a lot of people are taking interest in your videos because, one, you have a background of law. From what I understand, you're a law graduate, and you're obviously someone that very much, having said that, very much still believes in people's freedoms, and you strike me as someone that is very genuine. You're actively trying to respect people's freedoms while advocating for something that you believe in, And I'm curious to find out how much of this, because you speak about the common law quite a lot. Now, I know you have law in terms of the legalese system, because this is how it works in most countries, right? That pretty much seems to work outside of the common law. And then we have this system of common law, which actually pays respect to this idea of individual rights and so forth. How much of the common law stuff are you finding? Because I watch all these videos about people challenging the police officers through an understanding of the common law. how effective is that, and how effective has it been for you in dealing, if you've had encounters with the police, in dealing
So
with
I have had
police?
I've had a few encounters with the police. I take a slightly different strategy necessarily. I am aware of the common law stuff, and I am also aware of how effective it has been. My background and understanding from being taught through the education system was very much from the position of the education system through the mainstream narrative that lawyers are taught. So I tend to look for the more mainstream issues. Hence, for example, oftentimes a lot of people say things like statutes, you don't have to follow statutes if you don't consent to them, or something like that. It's something that I hadn't been taught. I'm not completely familiar with. So rather than using statutes as sort of saying I do not consent, I will read the statute. I will find flaws in the statute. I will then use any kind of common law which builds on the definitions and finds a way around it, or I'll look for a lack of definitions and where a police officer doesn't have the power. Last year, I was at a very small protest, sort of around the time all these protest movement was just kicking off, and it was a local one. There was probably about 40 people or so there. The police moved in and tried to break it up. What the lady who organized the protest did was she asked the police officer to read his oath. He refused, which is quite amusing because he swore to uphold fundamental human rights. He swore to uphold the law. None of those things were broken. In fact, the law actually protects our fundamental human rights. The Human Rights Act, which applies the European Convention on Human Rights, which upholds our right to freedom of assembly. So the police officers were ignoring the law. They were ignoring our human rights. And then I went over to speak to him and ask him a few questions about how the new law operates. And funnily enough, he didn't really have any answers. One of them was he said that I was part of the gathering. And I was asking, what's the actual distance you have to be from the other people to be part of the gathering? And he was just sort of dancing about all over the place with his words. He couldn't give me an answer. So I asked him again, and he said, I can't give you a definition for that. You'd have to go to the courts. And that's the thing. The police officer is assuming that he's judge, jury, and executioner, and he decides that the law is applied in this way. This is what Parliament meant when they were applying the law. And it's, I mean, for example, I'm going into the YouTube full time at the end of this month, but I've been working for the past few months in a sales position. So I've been sort of, selling a product. In order to do so, I need to understand that product fully. I need to be able to answer people's questions about that product. Otherwise, I'm going to be terrible at my job and I will be let go. The thing is, the police being publicly funded, which has very low standards. I mean, just as another side note here, we got a letter to the homeowner here at this house. And it was about notifying us of a pipeline that's being laid. And in the envelope, they had 4 or 5 copies of the exact same letter. It's like a 3-page letter, 4 or 5 copies of the whole thing, just in the envelope. I mean, it's things that are publicly run, from my experience, are generally inefficient and terrible. And it's the same thing with the police force, low standards. They don't know the law, which is kind of their job. They should know. They can't answer people's questions on the law. And they assume, I really think the thing is either better training or some serious reform of the policing system in this country.
Yeah, I'm finding that there are a lot of parallels between what's going on in the UK in terms of the law, how the system works, and what goes on in Australia. I mean, essentially, we work under the same kind of system here. We have a constitution. Obviously, it respects the idea of the common law, but based off of the understanding that I have at the moment, what I've been seeing, we're essentially working under 2 different kinds of law. I mean, we have the common law, but then we have admiralty law. And I think since about somewhere down I think around the 1970s, that we moved into this kind of law, which essentially ignores the Constitution, where we're seeing, I mean, granted, in Australia, we have this idea that any laws are null and void if they go against the Constitution. But what we're finding is that all of these laws have been created on the state level where they're completely disregarding the Constitution. And the only way that you can actually challenge these laws, because what often happens is police officers will arrest you for victimless crimes, right? And it'll go to the magistrate's court. Now, the way it works is you will only be able to make constitutional arguments only be able to make these arguments if you take it all the way to the highest court, the high court. But the way things work is that, typically speaking, unless you structure arguments in a particular way, you know what you're doing, you won't be able to you won't be able to have this stuff taken to the highest court. Like, more often than not, you will simply just be punished for a victimless crime. And the problem is that you won't actually get a hearing at the highest court because the entire system, like only a very small percentage of cases actually get heard at the highest court. And even then, I mean, we're at a situation at the moment where the very idea of lockdowns, which is unconstitutional, there's a particular individual that has made a case against uh, the government that these lockdowns are unconstitutional. But what's happening is even at the highest level, because the high courts do actually honor, from what I understand, the common law, but they're saying that they're not willing to actually rule on these issues because of the implications of this. They're either saying, "Oh, look, we'll get back to you," but they're playing this game where they're trying to just avoid this thing. Like even like just a while ago, we had curfews here, and I know you guys are having the same thing, which are completely insane. Like any person that understands like the Constitution will understand that this is blatantly a violation of our rights, but and this stuff has gone up to the courts, high courts, but somewhere down the line, this stuff has been completely ignored. And we're seeing the police officers. I mean, they're essentially acting like complete thugs at the moment. They're just arresting people because they're not wearing masks, which we obviously understand is completely unconstitutional. But we're somehow working in the system at the moment that has completely disregarded the most basic human rights, even though we're supposed to be still working within this free society.
They make it as difficult and expensive as possible to get to the highest levels and to make those constitutional arguments. I mean, from sort of my little bit of experience of law, I had a few work placements and things with the bar, like sort of shadowing barristers in court, that sort of thing. And I remember one particular case. It was a road traffic accident and a dispute with an insurance claim. So it was an old man's car was completely written off when it was hit by a delivery driver. The car was valued at about £900. The insurance company for the delivery driver offered to pay it privately in correspondence. The guy wanted an additional £300 for a custom stereo system he had. So they took it to court and to try and reach a resolution. But because of the way the procedure works, the judge wasn't allowed to see any of the correspondence between the parties. So the judge basically sat in the courtroom, listened very briefly to the barrister for each side, and then said, "Right, I decide £600 for the car," and then just walked out. And it's almost then there was basically no recourse after that unless they would have dished out goodness knows how much money. But the whole system is almost fundamentally broken in a certain way. It doesn't seem to work. Our democratic system as well is so corrupt. I mean, I just saw the other day the Boris Johnson and the Queen have announced the Queen's birthdays honours list. So who becomes an MBE, OBE, gets a knighthood, that sort of thing. And there are two knighthoods. One knighthood for a bloke who gave £500,000 to the Tory party, another one to someone who gave £500,000 to the Tory party. So I guess that's how much money it costs to buy a knighthood, I guess, £500,000, and then and you can become a sir.
Yeah, it's corruption, and it's happening on so many levels now. And one has to think the level at which it's happening, because whereas I try to be I try not to think the worst of people, whether or not they're in government, but I think the level of corruption that we're seeing at the moment is happening at such a level that it does seem like it has been orchestrated. I mean, I subscribe to the idea that nothing typically happens in government in the world, of this kind of level, unless, of course, it has been. There are some kind of like machinations in play, by certain figures. And the more that I've been reading this book, particularly, I mentioned none dare call it conspiracy theory. You realize this is from someone that's actually worked within government, how this entire thing works. And you're like, okay, that makes sense. But I just think that what is happening at the moment, whereas I can understand that obviously we live in a society, nothing's perfect, people are fearful, but the level, I mean, you spoke about how because of the indoctrination, people have a very warped idea of reality. But we're seeing a situation at the moment where people are putting the most ridiculous draconian measures in place. I mean, Melbourne, we just came out of a lockdown last week, but essentially we had police officers around the city that were beating up people that were, these aren't conspiracy theorists like myself, admittedly, that are questioning whether this thing is as severe as it is, this virus and so forth. These are people that are frustrated because they can't go back to work, because they've had their businesses ruined, because they're suicidal. The police were essentially accosting these individuals, treating them like shit, purely because they weren't wearing masks, so they were out. And I mean, there's this classic footage of this islander being pulled out of his car, just like that. Well, granted, the police weren't able to pull him out of his car because he was too big, and now these islanders are quite tough. But
Good
this
on
guy
him.
was essentially asked to step out of his car because, from what I understand, they'd scanned his license plate and it wasn't within the 5 kilometer radius. Which is, I mean, this is what it's come to. I mean, police officers, they're just randomly approaching people on the street now, and they're playing this game where if they simply suspect that you are not in your 5 kilometer radius, or you're a conspiracy theorist, and even the very idea of protesting now, which is I mean, this is obviously something that is enshrined within the Constitution. I mean, the most frustrating thing is the government is basically just going back and forth, and they're using the most insane justifications for it, that this virus is obviously very serious when you actually have a look at the mortality rates, and it doesn't seem like a proportionate response. So one has to think maybe there is something more to this than just meets the eye, because even for people that think that, we do need to have some kind of safeguards in place, I mean, is this stuff justified? I mean, and correct me, I'm curious to get your take on everything that's going. Like, do you feel as if the general attitude of the people in the UK at the moment is one of concern, like they actually feel like this is justified, what the government is doing, or are they woken to the fact that this is kind of crazy?
It's quite difficult to tell, really. I mean, the majority of people you sort of come across day to day will have their vaccine, they're bum shakavakas. They'll comply with everything. They won't be questioning. They'll have all these other distractions in mind. They won't really care a jot about what's going on at the moment. And if the government has been announcing, I think they're going to announce tomorrow officially that they're going to delay the June 21st Freedom Day reopening that they promised for a while. And the majority of people are going to say, oh well, it's fine. They delayed it. The government, they're the scientists. They'll think for us. But at the same time, the local protest movements are growing massively. I mean, there are a stand in the park events all around. I don't know. Do you have a stand in the park in Australia?
Stand in the park. Is this like a protest event?
Yes, yeah. It's like a locally organized thing where it's sort of all kind of like all under the same branding. I think it's a smiley face, a yellow smiley face is the logo, but it's basically local organizers all across the country. I think there's over 400 of them now or something, where it's local areas of people just on a Sunday will come out, stand in the park, have a picnic, just be normal and get back to real life for a few hours. But even the protests, just how massive they are, really goes to show that something's not clicking. Something I found quite amusing actually with the last protest. Every single protest up to now, the BBC has reported on as being hundreds of people. And I think at the last one, they said a couple of thousand. But the very last one in May, we tried to get to the BBC. We were blocked by the police 3 times. And then people tried to go through a shopping centre, and then it all kind of fell apart from there. But we were prevented by the police from standing outside the state broadcaster who we fund with our taxes and bringing a message to them. And meanwhile, the BBC completely refused to report on this last one at all. Like no mention of it on any of their Twitter accounts, on any of the websites.
We're seeing the same thing here in terms of the mainstream media tremendously underestimating the amount of protests that is actually appearing at these events. Granted, we're not having as much as you guys in the UK, but we've had thousands and thousands, and often they're just reported as hundreds. And I mean, I guess something that you've experienced a lot, I think anyone that is speaking out about what's going on here has experienced, is the censorship that's going on. I know, having watched a lot of your videos, you've experienced some kind of censorship as well. And it's reaching the point now where, like, I've been on YouTube for, I mean, from what I can see, you've been doing this just for a few months. I've been YouTubing off and on for years, and never, and this applies to most of the people that I know that have been on this scene, never have I had a video taken down, all right? Or received a strike for that matter. But just over the last few months, during the start of the year, it came just like that. I got 2 strikes within the space of a month or two. And my YouTube account was on the verge of closing down, and I was like, okay, I got to be really careful now. And I know you've experienced similar things. How bad have you had censorship, and how is this affecting you on other platforms? I mean, obviously it's happening in terms of you, even like what the media is reporting on these protests, but on social media, it's on a completely different level. What's your experience been like there?
I've tried to be fairly careful to stay within guidelines and things. I've been lucky enough that I've only really had one video that's been taken down that was discussing a garment
Yes.
that one wears on one's face,
Mhm.
and using official statistics and official data and information from the Health and Safety Executive, from the NHS, British Medical Journal, all these things. Doesn't matter, that's medical misinformation, got to take that down. But it almost seems like it's because I haven't been posting anything to YouTube, and I've been on YouTube for quite a number of years, and seeing how bad the censorship's gotten over the past few years. And it's almost like the entire internet. I mean, one of the things that surprised me a few weeks ago to find out was LiveLeak had been taken down.
Lively.
So LiveLeak was this website. It was quite infamous because it had a lot of gore and things like that on it. But it was
Okay.
basically a website for leaking or posting raw footage from phones and video and things from areas. So of course that did fester a lot of really, really nasty content, but also it was live on the scene. If ever an incident would happen somewhere, like there'd be an explosion or an attack or a natural disaster, if ever you wanted to find like the raw, uncensored footage of it or whatever, you go to LiveLeak. So I was a few weeks ago when the Israeli-Palestine situation was kicking off again. I was like, okay, the media isn't gonna really show the full extent of what's happening here from either side. And I went to LiveLeak and noticed that the website's been completely pulled. So but it's a lot of things. Content that isn't corporatized or easily monetizable seems to be more and more frequently just going offline now. The internet is becoming a more sensorial place, a more sanitized place than it used to be. It's no longer a Wild West.
Sure. I mean, over the last year, I think this was at the start of the year, YouTube had taken down over 800,000 videos. And whereas, to play devil's advocate, the argument is that the type of information that has been posted is dangerous because this is dealing with the medical information, because people are not going to take this thing seriously. People are going to die, so forth. But it, yeah, it flies in the face of the fact that we've had other severe viruses obviously in the past, and the fact that we're seeing these measures now, it just doesn't seem like a proportionate response, and then obviously you realize that I mean, this goes with Facebook and YouTube in terms of the fact checkers, that they're funded by a lot of the times by these pharmaceutical companies, and you realize, oh, I see what's going on over here. And I actually openly said this a while ago to one of my friends that, I can completely understand this in the sense that I would be doing, if I was putting out an album, like I'm a musician, if I was putting out some album and some person, and I happened to own this platform, and I had a group of people that were criticizing and saying, oh man, this album's crap, Chris Yule can't sing, this is shit. I'd be telling, the people that monitor this shit to take that shit down. You know what I mean? It's understandable. But when it's dealing with something that is, I mean, this comes down to not just your ego. This comes down to people's lives here. Like it. Yeah, I think and I understand the libertarian argument. These are private companies. Obviously, they can do what they want. They can censor what they want. But it comes down to fraud. The fact that they're claiming something is misinformation when it's not. And I guess this comes down to the whole conversation around freedom of speech. Like, if you're putting something on a platform that is not true, is that not considered fraud? And what are your thoughts on this? Because this is an interesting conversation, right?
It's a wider sort of the wider context is really what you need to pay attention to here. I mean, firstly, in America with these social media companies where they're based, they have this protection, which basically treats them as they're an independent platform rather than a publisher. So they're not personally liable as a business for what users post. So if they're going to curate content to such an extent, then why do they need to have that kind of protection?
Apparently that's being removed, though. I know what you're talking about. I forget the name of the actual section of the code, but apparently that's on the verge of actually being removed. So these companies are now going to be liable for whatever content their partners actually post. YouTube is a classic example of this. But even that being said, like the greater question is, I mean, personally, my whole stance on this, sorry to cut you off, but is that, people should, I mean, unless of course you're inciting violence, like unless you're actually calling for someone to be punished, I mean, people have a right to express whatever thoughts they want, like there are people that believe crazy ideas, in regards to reality, but I mean, that's an opinion. I mean, unless you're saying something that is actually an incitement of violence, I mean, I personally think you should be able to express whatever view you want about reality. I mean, that's
Yeah,
yeah.
it's an because if you were going onto a platform to like coordinate a terrorist attack or something, that would be an action. You'd be actively conspiring rather than just expressing an opinion that you don't like something. But it's even goes back to that example of when you said if you created like a forum for your music, and if there were people there expressing, because that's about a particular topic and that's controlled by you. The problem is at the moment is these websites aren't although they take the position that they're completely neutral. I mean, YouTube used to be YouTube broadcast yourself. Funny where the broadcast yourself's gone. But it's also in the context of lockdown and these sorts of things where we're not supposed to meet up with people, we can't go in the houses, stay home. All contact, all communication is online now. It is the new public square. That's just the way of the world at the moment. So to create these platforms and then not allow people to express certain opinions and take them down is dangerous and is an infringement of free speech, because these individuals, theoretically, these are private companies. You can say, go off, go create your own platform. But the thing is, these people don't have the resources to go and buy them. And if it was something like Parler, for example, they had Parler, they paid to use Amazon servers. Amazon took them down. So you have to create your own servers, create your own hosting, create your own everything, and then create like a high demand video sharing or social media content sharing website. People don't have the resources. It's practically impossible, which means that the censorship on these platforms is, for all intents and purposes, how in practice, basically an infringement on your free speech. It prevents you from being able to speak out. And it's so dangerous.
I see what you're saying there, and it comes down. It's a philosophical argument in terms of choice. You know, like when people feel as if there is little choice, they feel as if their rights have been infringed upon. But I always make a distinction between like the way that I look at freedom, provided you are not directly harming anyone. Like, granted, I may not be able to find a job and actually support myself. You know, because a lot of socialists make this argument. They don't think that employers should be able to create certain restrictions around their job, you know, because it's depriving them of a choice, that kind of thing, because they don't like the choice that's been given to them. But fundamentally, they still have the right to walk away from that job at any point. And it's, to me, there's always a distinction between choice versus the feeling of not actually having a choice. Because at the end of the day, you have a right to I mean, you could essentially leave the platform, and granted, you may not be able to express your thoughts, you know, through any other platform. You still have a choice to leave the platform. Whereas that's a little different to a situation where someone is saying that, look, like is actually violating your freedom and actually saying that, look, I'm going to hurt you if unless of course you work within this platform. I'm not sure if that really succinctly illustrated, but to me, it's a bit of a weird one, because whereas there's the argument that you feel as if you don't have any choice, therefore a company should not force this on you. You can always make that argument, you know, because at the end of the day, there's always a perception that you don't have a choice, but it's this idea that you have to, essentially you're deprived of any freedom because there's this perception that there's no other choice. You know, like I feel like it's a very difficult situation. I'm seeing this manifest at the moment with like this whole discrimination argument that's going on at the moment. Like what's happening here in the Gold Coast is that we're seeing businesses obviously saying that they don't want to have people that have received the boom shakalaka come into their store. But then inversely, we're also seeing people that are saying that if you have received the boom shakalaka, we don't actually want you in your store. Like there's actually a business, Camina High Vibe Frequency Salon, that actually made this announcement, and it brought about this entire conversation. Like, people shouldn't have the right to prevent you from coming into your salon, because if they prevent you from going to the salon, I mean, you could make someone that has been discriminated against could make the argument that, well, what other salon am I going to go into if you don't allow me to come into salon just because I haven't been vaccinated? But at the end of the day, they still have a choice to find other salons. It's just that their perception is that there aren't any salons. So what we're really arguing here is whether or not we should have the right to decide how we live our lives. And we're seeing this play out at the moment in this, like, if you have a look at Israel, what's going on, like there are all these invasive discrimination policies where people won't be allowed into gyms. Like essentially it's just insane. Like there's basically a vaxpartheid regime that's going on. I call it Vaxpartheid because it deals with the vaccine, but it's I don't see any solution to it in terms of like if I'm being completely consistent within the realm of freedom, because I don't see personally. I think people have a right to discriminate and to say that I don't want you using my platform, or I don't want you coming into my salon, even though you think that you don't have any choice to express yourself through freedom of speech, even though you think that you don't have any choice to go into these establishments. It's still my right to choose who I allow, because at the end of the day, I'm risking my own safety by allowing you into my business if I think you're putting me at risk. Does that kind of like get to the heart of what?
It does make sense. It does make sense. It's like it's a sense of like it's kind of the philosophical side rather than in some ways this is where to be pragmatic I will sometimes move away from liberty. For example, if there was hypothetically democracy, one restriction on capitalism would have to be keeping money out of politics. I mean, that could infringe on the business owner's right to think, I've made millions and millions, I'm now the CEO of this business, I have a right to give my money where I want to. Sure. But that's when it becomes very, very dangerous. You need to kind of have a few curbs and that sort of thing. So for example, with a salon, if there are other salons in the area, they absolutely have a right to discriminate. But with, for example, with banks, if say, for example, or PayPal payment systems, if you're taken off of all these platforms, especially if, for example, you're banned from Zoom as well, and Microsoft Teams and all the communication networks, if you were then taken down by BT or any of the telephone providers or internet providers, you could basically be completely cut off without anything. You do theoretically have the choice, but sometimes in practice, you don't necessarily have the choice whatsoever.
I love the fact that you've illustrated that very honestly, succinctly, basically steel manning both positions like that, because I feel like a lot of the times people overlook like the core distinction between these this argument here. You know, one's philosophical and the other's grounded in obviously theory, and it's something that we're facing right now, particularly in terms of I mean, we're in a situation where I personally foresee in the next couple of years we're going to be moving into this social credit system where if you've said anything that's basically out of line, you've expressed any views and so forth, I mean, we've actually applied vaccine passports now into the Medicare system. We use a system called Medicare now, and they're slowly implementing legislation where you will be denied access into certain establishments if you don't have this vaccine passport. And it's very easy to see a situation where they extend this to, if you've said the wrong kind of stuff, now you won't be allowed access to certain banks. You won't be allowed access to, it goes on and on and on, to the point where theoretically, yes, you still have a choice, you know, but realistically, you're not going to be living in a very free society, you know? And I think this is the real, because at the moment we're seeing the government use its powers to essentially take away the choice of individuals and private businesses, you know? And there's this weird kind of relationship with government and private businesses that is really, that even though these private businesses have the right to do what they want, they're really not acting in a free manner because they're being coerced by the government. And it's very dangerous now, because I literally cannot enter a store here in Australia unless, of course, I scan a QR code. I mean, whether or not I do that, that's another thing entirely. But theoretically, that's what we're dealing with. And it would be one thing if these businesses were saying, oh, wait a sec, look, you can't enter this store unless, of course, you scan it. But they don't actually want that. It's the government that's saying, unless, of course, you implement this, we're going to fine you. So it's this dirty relationship between private businesses and the government that has led to the kind of situation we're in at the moment, where we're on the verge of a two-tier system. And this is the real threat, because I want to speak about the future just briefly with you. Like, where do you see this thing going? Because one of the things I like about your videos is you're very optimistic, you're very inspiring. I try to be like that, but I also am a bit of a realist, and having read so much about history and so much about like the conspiracy realist stance on what is really going on, you realize that the people in control of this shit, yeah, they're not really nice. And I don't see this, to be completely frank, I either see this at a point where we move into the realm of compulsion. And what I mean by that is the government moves away from saying, unless, of course, you take this thing, you won't be able to get like what do you call it, like social security payments and so forth, to a realm,
basic income, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, to a realm where it's like, unless, of course, you get this thing, oh, wait a sec, you can't leave your house, we're going to fine you. oh,
Mm.
you're going to be you're going to be punished, and then eventually it moves into by force, which is the final frontier where it's like, bro, you ain't taking me. And we actually have legislation in Western Australia now where a police officer can wait for this. They can actually use a reasonable amount of force to give you a vaccine if you refuse. That's on the books as of 2015, I think it was. I may have um I may have gotten the date wrong, but yeah, it's been in the books for a few years now. This is what we're dealing with. So
That is
where do you
it's
see
terrible.
it beyond words, man? Like in my opinion, I think the worst thing that you can do to an individual, right, is rape them. But a lot of people don't see it like that. They don't see this as rape. It's like, oh, it's just a jab. Yeah, but you may, first of all, you're forcing something in my body that may very well actually, you know, have some very nefarious effects on me. And I mean, what else you? I mean, if you can justify that, then you can justify anything. And granted, it may not be immediate. Like if this was someone coming to your house and killing you, a lot of people would frown on that. But if this is putting something in your body that may have a delayed response somewhere down the line, I see that as the ultimate evil. And I don't make a distinction between people that are willing to support governments that will actually do that to you, and it's in contrast to people that are willing to support legislation that denies people basic access to services unless, of course, they get vaccinated. Like one is kind of like a subtle coercive technique that the governments use, and the other is, in your face, but they all result in the same kind of thing, which is rape in my mind.
I think it almost is a bit like the distinction between the theory and the reality, and that the theory is, yes, if the governments are completely unrestricted, that is what they want to do. They want to take us to. If you look over history, all of history, the trend has been more and more and more control by the government, and also not only in terms of freedoms that we have in terms of civil liberties, but also financial freedom. The government's control over the money and their destruction of the money system, particularly what we've seen with, for example, the furlough system here. A lot of people haven't worked since last March. They've been paid by the government to just stay home. And a lot of that, some of it's borrowed, a lot of it's just sort of created out of thin air. And I mean, just look at America, how much money they've created over the past year. It's really, financially, there's going to be some sort of financial reset. Now, here's the thing. There is, no matter what happens, going to be some sort of great reset. Now, I don't. It's easy to be very caught up in pessimism and being defeated because it's overwhelming. It's so terrible. When you go on social media, everyone around is pro what's going on, and then you go on those protests and you realize just how the reality and the narrative that they try and present to us really is completely manipulated and couldn't be any further from the truth if they tried.
Solid point, yeah.
And they try and make us feel as pessimistic and defeated as possible, but so long as because as I say, we're not sort of just tumbleweeds being blown along by circumstance. We are independent human beings with free agency, and I believe that the British people are really getting to the end of their tether, and they really are being very irritated. Now, financially, there will be some sort of reset. What that entails, who only knows? All I know is our current fiat currencies are pretty much doomed. But I believe that if the government don't win, the people will win. The people will have their own reset, and it will be a people's reset.
I admire your positive outlook, brother. And that brings me to, I guess, the alternative modes of like commerce that we're going to be using. I've heard you speak a little about Bitcoin. What are your thoughts on that? Because you find a lot of people within the kind of freedom movement, they kind of move towards this because, I mean, personally, I think it's a great way to move away from a fiat currency that is fueling, this stuff that we're seeing at the moment. It's responsible for dropping bombs on so many innocent people around the world. And more importantly, I think it's a viable alternative to the current system that we're using. So what are your thoughts on the whole cryptocurrency space? Do you think it's a feasible currency?
Yes, it definitely has a lot of amazing practical applications. So I'm very much of the old school belief in money in terms of physical gold and silver,
Sure.
because it's finite, it's desirable, it'll always have value, and it's the best protection against inflation. Cryptocurrencies, also being separate from the system, are a very good bet against inflation when it hits. The only issue is an individual crypto can be very unstable and more easily influenced by current events. But that isn't a condemnation of Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency whatsoever. In fact, in the future, now that we have the internet, and if we have more people using Tor, more people using a free internet, that way, individuals, if you want to, for example, make a purchase, rather than having to get some gold in an envelope and post it out to someone, you can just buy some crypto from an exchange, send someone some cryptocurrency. I mean, there are websites where you can buy. There's one in the UK that's just started accepting. One of the biggest bullion dealers just started accepting Bitcoin, called Chards. So you can buy your bullion in Bitcoin. You can also sell your bullion for Bitcoin. So it's directly interchangeable. It's not controlled by the central system, and it's a way of having your savings, having your money being protected. And if you want to make a transaction, you can do so easily using this tool. So we don't need to rely on bankers writing a note to another bank to transfer money that way. We can do it ourselves. And that's the amazing thing about cryptocurrency, is its financial freedom, not just in terms of possessing the money, but using the money as well. And that's the brilliant part about crypto.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. King Peter the Virile, I've absolutely loved talking to you, man. I love the fact that you're so knowledgeable, and I love your energy. It's great to see someone like yourself that is advocating for freedom, that is inspiring people. And I think we need to see more people like yourself doing this. So I know you mentioned you're looking at making the whole YouTube thing a full-time thing. Best news I've heard all week, bro. I support you doing that. And if there's anything I can do to promote you, put your information out there, brother, love to support you in any way, shape, or form. You are a scholar, you're a gentleman, and you are truly a king and a virile man. And I really do believe that it's only a matter of time before more and more people, we're seeing it in the UK, become awoken to what's going on. I always like to say that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think throughout history, it always takes a bit of time, but you see small little groups, activists slowly coming together and inspiring more people. I mean, I think it was George Washington only had like a small group of people that were against what the Brits were doing, at the time, but it manifested in this massive movement, and I think what is happening in the UK, what is happening in Australia and around the world is like that. I think we can't forget that we are under this dream spell because of the mass media at the moment, and things are not as grim as they appear. And bro, I just want to say finally, man, that look, if people want to get in touch with you, I got your details, but do you have any events, anything that you'd like to just drop here so people can be up to speed with what you're doing?
So at the moment, I mean, I'm going to be filming a bit more content this weekend, so to put out over the next week. Like I said, I'm going to be finishing work at the end of this month. So from the start of July, it's going to be content at a much more frequent pace, which I'm very much looking forward to. If you want to meet me in person, anyone who's in the UK who's watching, I will be there in London on the 26th, and I hope you will be there too, because the movement is only growing, and it is all around the world. It's like the song "We Are the 99%." It's been sung in the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, I think Denmark, all around the world. Same song.
Powerful. King Peter the Virile, I love what you do, brother. God bless your soul, and I look forward to putting this out there on the interwebs and awakening people up to the real message. That there is a movement, and there definitely will be change. Brother,
thank you very much, mate. You do fantastic work. Absolutely. It's all of us around the world in every corner of the globe, all doing our bit to share the world. And we are part of something that will go down in the history books. God bless you too, my friend.
Thanks, brother. Thanks again for coming on this podcast, brother. Really appreciate that. Peace out.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor.
It's been a pleasure, brother. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you. Take care.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was King Peter the Virile. It's been a fun podcast. We've covered quite a lot of topics. I'm going to put this up on iTunes, up on Odyssey. Yeah, obviously this will be up on YouTube. Ladies and gentlemen, check out the links below. I'm going to put down the details to get in touch with King Peter the Virile. And peace out, keep it real. Don't drive in text. Remember to always illuminate your mind with wisdom, strengthen your will with love, and purge all negative thought patterns from your existence. This is your chocolate Nubian soul brother, aka the esoteric noetic, signing out. Chris Jewell. Ow!
You won't work it, don't wait for us, you won't make it. I don't hear